Mil gracias for being with us here today. This is Sonia.
This is Gabby.
And this is Sophia.
We are Señora Power. And if your reaction to that is ¿qué? Check out the first episode to catch up on who we are, what this project is, what we're up to. But if you're with us so far, you're listening to part one of Church Señoras, where we investigate how religious spaces and the Mexican American women who inhabit those spaces have helped their communities. It's a complex topic, right? We have many emotions, memories. There's lots of intertwining histories here. So to get through this huge topics of churches, religion, racism, and community, we're going to start really granular, not small, but local, with Señora Petra, a Mexicana from Houston's Second Ward. Let's begin. Petra Guillen was born Petra Maria Ruiz in San Luis Potosí in Mexico in 1919. Her mother and grandmother brought her to Baytown, Texas, when she was 10 months old. Baytown is a town east of the booming metropolitan Houston, where her uncle worked at an oil refinery, and it gave her family the opportunity to escape the violence and upheaval following the Mexican Revolution. As Petra and her family settle into this new environment, they find community with one specific church, Our Lady of Guadalupe. It's a Catholic church that was recently established in 1912. You see, Mexican immigrants and Mexican American citizens were experiencing harassment from the Ku Klux Klan, who regularly entered Baytown looking to fight and threaten non-white people. Petra's grandmother gets really fed up with this. I mean, how couldn't you, right? And she finds solace in Our Lady of Guadalupe, which we will refer to amongst ourselves as Guadalupe or OLG. So Petra's grandmother moves the family to the primary church location in Second Ward, where Mexicanos and Mexican Americans were establishing their own neighborhood just east of Houston's downtown area. In an interview that we had as a team with Señora Petra's daughters, Lidia Guillen Lopez and Linda Guillen Duron, they speak of this community of OLG especially with a tender fondness.
I loved Guadalupe. There is no question about it. I loved it. When we were in the 8th grade, I had mentioned I wanted to, purposely fail the 8th grade because I wanted to stay at Guadalupe. That's how much I loved it. It was just everything to me. It was a community that had a common core in the word love. And it was love for the church, love for each other, love for our customs and our language, love for the food, love for the tears and the joy. It was just love here and there.
You know, Guadalupe is a shrine for Mexican Americans. You know, it was established that way.
In many ways, OLG is literally a shrine named after La Virgen de Guadalupe or the Virgin Mary. It is a testament to the love and connection that many people of Mexican descent feel for the Virgin Mary. In another way, OLG is a shrine of the efforts community members made to fundraise for the literal foundations of this church, the actual buildings, which when you visit consist of the main congregation, some office and community spaces, and a school for pre-K through 8th grade. So in many ways, it's also a testament to the love and care within this specific community.
That can be seen more on the feast day, December 12th. If you ever want to see the power of Our Lady of Guadalupe, go to the feast day and you will see about 10,000 people, not just from Second Ward, but not just from the city, the inner city. It's actually people will come from other little towns and cities to come in for the feast day.
We're talking about a church community that wasn't allowed to sit in the pews of many Catholic churches at that time. Mexicans were forced to stand in the back or allowed the furthest pews from the altar without any ability to understand the Latin sermon or English-speaking congregation. without any chance to actually take part in these religious spaces or communities. OLG, though, it was one of the first places many Mexican immigrants went to after landing in Houston. It's what Señora Petra might have called a second home. In fact, Señora Petra was educated at OLG until the 8th grade. And again, Houston schools were segregated until 1968 and not even fully integrated until 1984. So the education opportunity alone, right, was massive. It's a source of empowerment for Second Ward, but also Mexicans and Mexican Americans throughout Houston. It was a huge part of Señora Petra's education. It's obviously religious, right? It was a massive part of her identity. In fact, she became a catechist. What do y'all know about being a catechist?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Myself. I personally have never been a catechist, but I did go to Catholic school from K through 12 in Houston.
I guess what do like catechists do?
Yeah, I think catechist in the past, like in Señora Petra's time, was really a designation for what now would be called maybe a CCE teacher, or sometimes depending on the group that you're talking to, sometimes it's like akin to a youth leader. So a catechist is somebody who takes upon it themselves to the religious education of children usually, but people in general who don't have access to religious education in their schooling for whatever reason. In the past, this was like way more common because there'll be like one person who maybe went to school or maybe went to Catholic school. And so they could provide that for their community. And that's kind of like more of a community member role, even though priests and clergy people also have that calling in their job, I guess, the job description. But catechists are people in the community who are not ordained, who are basically like religion teachers. And in OLG, in Señora Petra's context, and a lot of context as well in this era, those people who were teaching religious education would go to other people's homes and do it. So that's basically a sum up of what a catechist is.
That is so interesting, Gabby, that you're talking about the regional differences in the catechism, right? I didn't know that it could be sort of like informed by the local community in that way, which is kind of like thinking back to the history of OLG. That's kind of what happened, right? Based on Señora Petra's teachings and others like her, other catechists, it was the Mexican community that came together, as Sonia just shared, to found that church for themselves. So it's interesting how the señoras the señoras going from house to house teaching the catechism can also influence these bigger sociopolitical sort of events and histories.
And Señora Petra definitely did that. She went house to house. She was really well known. In her oral history, she shares lots of funny anecdotes about like the padres like knocking on doors and like interrupting people's days. She in fact almost became a nun. Like she was really close to joining the convent. Unfortunately, her grandmother got very sick right at the time that she went away. Thus, she had to come back and take care of her. But luckily at that time, she met her husband, Bill Guillen. And that's when she becomes Petra Guillen. She ends up having 13 kids. So along with 13 kids, Petra was a huge part of her community, not only as a catechist, but OLG became a real space for her to connect with people. We learned from the same interview with her daughters that she went on 87 pilgrimages.
You know, my mother did pilgrimage to San Juan. Oh. And she did 87 twice a year, or she would do 3 times a year. Mm-hmm. Now, she was in charge. She would do it. She would get a bus. She would do all of the calculation per individual for when you got to San Juan, how much the room was going to cost, so she could tab it in with the expense of the bus as well, and be able to have also money to give to the driver.
I don't know if I've done 87 of many things,
Wow.
Fun thing. So I guess it'd be interesting to hear y'all's thoughts on what it means to help people go on pilgrimages, especially that many times, right? Like she didn't do it once or twice, but she was such a pillar in the community that she almost did it 100 times.
Well, and she did these pilgrimages to a very specific place. So I guess pilgrimages to the Basilica for like a religious purpose, but also in just the act of getting the group together, getting the group organized, and, you know, spending some time together as a community.
The simplest explanation is it's a trip to a religious place for usually for a certain purpose, as in you would like to ask a saint or God or Mary, you know, to grant you a certain thing, like like my child is sick, for example, like I'm going to travel to this religious place and ask for that child to get better. People will literally crawl on their knees to the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City, because they feel that this suffering will either atone for a certain sin or will like make it more serious that they're asking for something that they want granted, right? So as you can see, pilgrimages span a whole spectrum. They are kind of a big undertaking and they require a lot of administrative skill.
Let's talk about that. Well, I think it's important to note that Señora Petra was a mother, yes, was a catechist, yes, was an almost nun, but she was also basically a church administrator, and in a time when like women weren't particularly welcome in the administration of churches, or if they were welcome, it was that sort of emerging, you know, wave of women joining the workforce in that way. And it wasn't a workforce either, right? Like it was just a space of needing to organize, needing to put together people to do that work, to rent the buses, to pay for the hotels, to gather the money. Just another thing to add in here before you respond to Señora Petra as an administrator, as an organizer, she also helped run with her husband a thrift store. The thrift store, we learned, doesn't have a name, but it was well recognized in the community as a place to buy cheap recycled clothing that the money you spent there went to OLG. So in part it was a fundraiser, and another part it was a really accessible way to get clothing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thinking about all these things in common with Señora Petra, pilgrimages, thrift stores, yes, the administrative skill necessary to run a store, first of all,
like any store,
any store, any of them. And then also for the pilgrimages, I think her daughters were saying that it wasn't just like 2 or 3 people who would go on these pilgrimages. It was like buses and buses, like multiple buses of people. And they did share a story about one of these pilgrimages.
They went on a pilgrimage as per usual. And sometimes what they'd like to do is cross the border to Matamoros, which is a border town in Mexico. And they would go just little, you know, mercados de tiendas to buy gifts to bring back, which is like very common, very normal. But when they were stopped in, I believe it was like a restaurant, or they were just resting in a place, and some soldiers came, they had their rifles, they had their uniforms, they felt like, the way that the story was told to us, they brought this like masculine military energy towards the church congregation who were resting in Matamoros. And Señora Petra immediately, like, the heckles raised, and she felt protective of not only the congregation, but she felt that the soldiers were eyeing the young women who were with them. And the bishop who went on this journey stood up and basically was like, "Why are you over here? Like, get away. What are you doing?"
And not that they were saying they were going to do anything, but you never know.
Right.
But mom stood her ground too. You know, she también, ¿por qué vienen para acá? ¿Por qué nos hacen así? ¿Por qué están? And they just looked at her. And she was like, "No, I'm in charge of this. Yeah. You don't mess this." But yeah, she was a really spicy person.
Oh, she definitely
That's the way I
liked to
would
fight
say
in.
it.
What struck me when we were hearing this story is that the daughter who was telling us about this was saying that she felt scared, like, or she felt like there was some change in atmosphere, right? And that her mother was there trying to protect her, and that she felt like she needed to keep her eyes down, but that Petra was willing to like stand up and face this soldier, and that she really was saying like, you have no business here. Ultimately, the bishop backed, or the priest who was with them backed her up, and used, I think this was not told to us, but I interpret it as using his like American male privilege to step in, and also in a way his institutional privilege to step in there, to say like, you know what, even if you don't respect these people, you have to respect me. But I think what's admirable there and what's notable is that Petra understood that this was like a threatening situation, and that she was willing to stand up for the people who were coming with her on this trip. I think that shows like exceptional leadership. And I think that's also something that, like, when it was told to us, it felt like, oh, it could have either been in her role as leader or her role as mother, that she was standing up to protect these young women. And I think in a way, there's not really, in many of the stories of these señoras, especially in Petra's story, it's like, what is the difference between being a mother and a leader, right? Like, and I think that's pretty cool, because when you think about what her advocacy was and all that stuff, like, she didn't really have like formal jobs, but she worked so hard. And she displayed like all these skills, including leadership, administration, like organization, financial savvy, because also for the pilgrimages, when they were organizing them, people would have to pay Petra because she was the organizer. And so she would, apparently, her daughters told us, she would keep a little accounting of, not really little, of who had paid her and how much they paid her for the pilgrimages. And she was like, okay, I'm missing like this much money from you. When are you going to pay this? And that person, was like, oh my gosh. Okay. Yes. Right. So she had both the, like, I guess, to use this old-timey word, she had the gumption to like, say, I need you to pay me, right? Or to stand up to a soldier in Mexico and be like, you don't get to just come in here. I'm going to use my resources. And I'm also going to like understand the power dynamic and use this priest as a resource too. I think that's amazing. And I feel like, in a way, as a person who's trying to become like an empowered señora, that's very inspirational to me, right? So yeah, that's what I took away from the pilgrimage story, and also the thrift store, fact.
Yeah. And I guess going back to Sonia's question about Gaby's question of what's the difference between a mother and an administrator. And I guess what Señora Petra teaches us is that they're very similar roles, right? Like, if you're taking care of 13 kids and, you learn the skills to take care of an entire group of people, a busload of people that you can then, aid as a way of like gathering resources too, right? Especially, Gaby, with your explanation of like what a pilgrimage is in terms of atoning for your sins, but also asking for assistance, reassurance, demonstrating your faith and everything. Like, that's a specific kind of resource that is valuable for this community. And so Señora Petra, just by having the gumption and the skills and the administrative talent for what she does, right, she is actively gathering resources for her community.
I think that's all great. And I think to add even more roles to what we're thinking of when we think of Señora Petra, we learned also that many people in the community saw her as a good listener. What responses do you have to thinking of a respected woman in a community who people would go to her home or to the church and ask specifically for her? They would say, I need to talk to somebody, like, I'm feeling really bad about this, or I have this situation. Well, you can talk to me. No, I need like Señora Petra. What does that say to you, I guess, about her role?
I guess it shows me like the specific kind of not status, but the specific kind of relationship that she was able to have with other people. In this religious context, I'm thinking of like the confession, right? Showing up and like talking to the priest or the bishop or whatever, and confessing your sins. But it's a very different thing to show up to someone in more of like a quotidian kind of like a gossipy chismosa way, and show up and be like, hello, I am having this difficulty. I know that you've been through something similar. Can you please help me out here?
And to know, God, like sharing these intimate details, knowing that Señora Petra would not share with other people. She seemed to be somebody that they trusted with their privacy, with their lives, with their vulnerability.
And it seems like she was not someone who was going to judge them, right? In terms of like the people who were similar to her in the same community with her same values, right? The kinds of difficulties that they were going through were probably shared difficulties across the communities.
No, it's true. And one word that we like kept coming back to with the interview is like the sense of justice. Like she did have a strong sort of orientation towards helping people get what either they deserve, what they haven't gotten, what was taken from them, like a really strong sense of justice that you would go to about like rent, like you would go to about produce, right? Her husband worked in a produce factory and often helped her supply food to the community. They would hold these jamaikas or like a bazaar, like a community gathering to fundraise for the church, but also to provide like not only entertainment and socialization, but like food and like material resources to the community. So I think you're spot on with that.
I also think that talking to people in this kind of community, there's kind of an interior and an exterior life that coexist at the same time, right?
As a Catholic or as a like a Mexican American community?
I think the intersection of both. But I think in general, right, also we all have interiority, exteriority. But I think that like thinking about the women or even just like the religious people that I've come into contact with or in my family, right, there's a difficult, especially maybe in this era, people who were raised in this era, there's on one level, this is what I was raised to believe is right. And then a connected but different level is this is what I truly believe is right. And I think that when talking about Señora Petra with her family, what came up the most was the idea of integrity, that Petra had integrity. And that is something that, talking about her being a good listener, there must have been a reason why everyone kept going to her on one level, because yes, maybe she was a good administrator. And so but maybe she knew all the resources, but on another level, because she made people feel like they could talk to her about difficult things. So on one level, okay, maybe she was like, this is what the church teaches, or this is what my society teaches me is right or good or respectable, right? But then on the maybe more important level, people understood that she was there to build community, or she was there to participate in community, because you don't go to someone with something difficult if you know they're going to shun you or judge you. So I think that that's something interesting and important, especially when thinking about how do you reconcile the values of your institution that you're affiliated with and your own values. Sometimes it's hard, right? Like even in other institutions, like academic institutions, or like,
don't know about that. Nothing.
Don't know about that. Not bad.
No. You bring up a very important point, both of you. And so I feel like we should wade a little bit deeper here. In her oral history, Señora Petra claims, just really blatantly, forthright, I was an activist. Note that. And when she's saying that, she's talking about the Metropolitan Organization of Houston, TMO. It's a interfaith sort of nonprofit that has multiple sort of divisions that work. They have like stances on immigration, they have stances on like pay equality. Senora Petra was especially vocal during her time with TMO on Mexicans and women getting fair pay. At the same time, she was a pro-life activist, and we hear from her daughters in the interview about how they were, picket signs for like pro-life were like in their hands at a young age, right? I think this is speaking to what you're talking about, Gabby, and I'd love to like open it up more and think about these intertwining complexities that come in with the institutions like a church space. Because obviously we have very different, as who we are now, we feel very differently than some of this. Not all of it.
I think it's really relevant right now because as I'll speak personally, right? As somebody who has a uterus, as somebody who identifies as a woman, and as someone who has seen some of my peers have to go through difficult situations, right, in recent years because of recent administrations and recent legal decisions, right? I think it's a really important thing to talk about and to learn about and to kind of try to be in conversation with our predecessors about. The way that the Catholic Church teaches about abortion. So I'm gonna talk about that a little bit just for any listeners who might feel that they don't want to listen to that. I completely respect that. But the way that the Catholic Church teaches about abortion is that it is like the murder of babies. Now, that's like a very extreme way of putting that, I think, personally, in my opinion. And if you learn that from like a very young age, it really does feel and like internally like a real truth that it's something that's violent. Now, growing up with the resources that I had, being able to go to college, interact with people who were not raised like that, and also make up my own mind, I think that was a blessing to me as an individual. And I think that not everyone has that opportunity or has had that opportunity in their life. Still, though, it's important to look at like where that impetus to hold up the pro-life signs at the rallies and do all those things. I think it's important to analyze where it comes from, especially if you don't agree with that, right? I mean, it's something that if you contextualize it, I think it makes it more accessible to have conversations with those people. And as like a community organizer, it's something that I had to learn that the people that you have to organize the hardest are the people who don't agree with you. So I think for me personally, as a community organizer who is pro-choice, I think it's very important for me to understand from my upbringing, okay, this is where these people are coming from. How can we have a conversation? Because in the end, like what I would like to see in this world is for people to be able to like have a right over their own bodies. So that's I think looking at, for example, Señora Petra's story, I can understand why she would be pro-life and also pro-women having equal pay. Right. Her family told us she never really had formal like work, like a formal job. But as we have discussed before, all the things she was doing were like labor. And so she clearly felt that, women deserved to be treated equally. And so I think that understanding her pro-life stance is understanding maybe how much she felt passionate about everyone being given the chance to have a full life, even if I don't see it that way personally, right? But I think that maybe like that stance comes from that ambition or that desire for people to have a full life.
The integrity and the justice.
Yeah, for sure. And Gabby, I think you bring up a very important point, which is that in this moment in time, being pro-life is a teaching, right? It's not like an opinion, it's not like a decision that someone makes. It's like you're taught that this is the opinion to have. I mean, and in terms of the broader socioeconomic economic and historical context that the Mexican community in Houston, was facing in this moment in time in the early 1900s. We've talked already about the church as a site of resource gathering, as a site of community building. If this is the main institution that is providing support for your community at this point in time, it's not going to be easy to stand against the main teachings of this institution, right? Like, oh, I'm going to have a differing opinion, and it's not going to affect the livelihood of my community in any way. Like, you cannot do that in that moment in time, right? This is not to justify the positions that they were taking at this time. It's just to sort of add complexity to all of these different historical periods and the way that people have had to react.
I think it's really important. I feel like right now it feels like an open wound for our community. For me, it certainly does. It feels like something that sometimes we say, like, oh, it's generational. Older generations feel that. Oh, it's like religious people. Religious people feel that abortion shouldn't be okay. But it's like much bigger than that, I think, and like much more complex. And I think hopefully this conversation and this narrative of Señora Petra shows like where these histories are coming from, and these conversations have been unfolding for literal decades. But I think to add to the contextualization as well, a big way of protecting the community for a long time, especially before desegregation, was to protect the idea of a family. I think currently we're super critical of like the nuclear family for good reason, but when Señora Petra was caring for not only her 13 kids, but the people that she was in contact with in Second Ward, families were literally being ripped apart, like by immigration, by violence, by war in Mexico, war in the US, and protecting this idea of like family was really, really important. And for a long time, abortion was considered like a white woman, as Gabby mentioned earlier, like with birth control, a white woman's idea, right? And it was also thought to be like something that wrecks like the identity, la raza, the identity of like Mexicans and Mexican Americans. I don't know if that's helpful contextually, but it's definitely a part of, I think, why Señora Petra felt that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're really driving home is that as if we're looking at like women's history, people who identified as women have never had it like easy.
No.
and everyone is like very complex, right? Some people have privilege, and that makes their complexity easier to digest, I think. But people who have to make hard decisions in the narrative of history, like, how are we going to see them? And I don't think that, we should just be uncritical of like history, but I also think that, if Señora Petra was my grandmother, I would want people to be generous with her. Because if somebody looked at my life, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know, right?
I feel like in hindsight, there's always things that you're gonna find to critique and to criticize, and that's the point of having these conversations, right? To actually look back and be like, oh, wait a second, that's kind of weird, or whatever, right? But I feel the same way. Like in 30-40 years, what are people gonna say about the stuff that I do, right? Like maybe I don't have it all the way correct right now.
Yeah. Well, I think like it might be a little bit of an academic term, but sometimes I like to say like we have different horizons, right? Like all of us, especially Señora Petra, we're working with a sense of justice, with a sense of like, I want to care for people and I want people to live a valued and valuable life. And we have different understandings at different periods of time of what that means. I also think that like highlighting the complexities, even though we can't like resolve them, like we're not going to resolve like this question on this podcast or probably even in our lifespan. But I think like highlighting the complexities is helpful. Not only the complexity of like being pro-life along with like fighting for fair wages at the intersection of race and gender, like the complex space of the church. Like churches are not known for being like spaces for women empowerment, right? and yet like Señora Petra was able to make an impact here, so that over decades we're still talking about her because of the impact that she left, the good impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And we still have so many other things to talk about in terms of the church as an institution, as well as just other kinds of institutions that señoras have used to gather resources for their specific communities. So make sure you stick around for next episode, our Church Plática, where we examine how señoras move within the space of the church.
Thank you so much for talking about Señora Petra with us.